And then before I hand it over to Navaneet, so I just want to introduce him. So Navaneet is a sophomore in his high school now. So most of you know he is passionate about spelling and vocabulary, and from the very early age, and he did extremely well in the Script Spelling Bee. And also he won almost all the national spelling bees, South Asian Spelling Bee and the North-South Foundation Bee, as well as the SpellPundit Spelling Bee. He was a top candidate for the Script Spelling Bee during the 2020. So, I mean, because of the pandemic that's got cancelled, unfortunately, he lost a miss, but otherwise he had a perfect chance to win that bee too. So this is just to say that you're in expert hands. So he knows what he's talking about. He can guide you through the dictionary skills and the rules. Okay, Navneet, I'll hand it over to you.
Sure. So the main thing that you need to start is figuring out the correct dictionary to use. And the only dictionary that you should be using is Merriam-Webster's online unabridged dictionary. And the reason that you should use this dictionary is because Scripps and pretty much every other bee, this is the official source. So this should be your first step, getting this dictionary. It obviously makes a huge difference because it's the official source. But apart from just that fact, there are many other advantages that are associated with it. For example, similar to what Uncle talked about in regards to searching words with specific letter combinations, you can do that as well in the unabridged dictionary. You can do advanced searches. For example, if you want to find all the words in a certain language with a specific letter combination, or words with a certain root, you can do that with a dictionary. So you should first start off by getting this dictionary, and you can use it to supplement everything else that you're studying. Next slide, please. So in order to understand everything in the dictionary, you should first understand how to pronounce words. There's something called the diacritic system, and that allows you to, it's sort of the standardized language, so to speak. It's organized completely by phonetics. So if you understand the diacritical marks, you can be able to pronounce everything in the dictionary. There are some basic sounds that you see in almost all words, as well as some other complicated sounds that you see in more advanced words from other like obscure languages. We'll go over the diacritic system. And the reason there is a diacritic system instead of just letter combinations for pronunciations, that's because each language that English took words from, they have different ways of spelling words. So if you have one system for everything, that makes pronouncing things much more easy and much more reliable. So I'll start by going over the basic sounds. Since we have a lot of participants, try to follow along with what I'm saying. If you don't understand the sound, send a message through the chat. Either way, keep in mind that we'll be having a question and answer session at the end. So the first sound and the most important sound in spelling is the schwa sound. The schwa is the upside down E that you can see here. Let me annotate. It's the most important sound because it's the most confusing. It can be spelled in so many different ways, depending on the language that the word is from. The schwa is pronounced So for example, both the first A and the last A in the word banana have the schwa. So banana. And it can be spelled in different ways as well. Another basic word with it is the word collect. And you can see the O makes the schwa sound there. The schwa might seem easy at the first glance, but most spellers who miss their words, it's generally the schwa that traps them, because as much as it sounds like a basic sound, it's the most variable because there's so many different ways of spelling it. It can pretty much be any vowel. And in some other languages, that might not even be the case. So there's so many different ways of spelling it. The most fundamental thing, though, is understanding how it's pronounced. The schwa again is pronounced The next sound is the short A sound. It's pronounced like that. It's basically how A is pronounced in the word mat, the word nap, cat, etc. It's the sound. In general, short sounds like the short A sound, they're pronounced for a lesser amount of time, as you can see from the name of the sound. So it's mat. The next sound is the long A sound. Whenever the name of a letter is, or the name of a vowel is followed by, or is preceded by the long phrase, that means it's basically the name of the letter. So the long A is pronounced A, like the letter, Similarly, we'll get there in a bit. The long E is just the letter E. But the long A is relatively straightforward. It's like the AY in the word day, or the A in the word fade. Understanding the names apart from just how the diacritics look is also important when you're talking. For example, it's important to know the long A has a line over it, but you should be able to associate the A sound with the phrase long A. That just makes communication easier. The next sound is the sound. So this is A with 2 dots on top. Those 2 dots in this case are called the umlaut. The umlaut is a pronunciation symbol that's generally seen in German, but it's a diacritic mark as well. It's the sound in bother or caught. There's also another more intense form of this sound, the sound. We'll see that on another slide, but those 2 sounds can potentially be confused. So there is a small distinction. This is more of like a softer version. So it's just think about the examples for each sound, and that'll make the distinctions a little bit easier. So bother or caught. The next sound is actually a combination of 2 sounds, but it's used so often that it's considered a marking of its own. It's the short A mixed with the short U sound. So it's the sound mixed with the U sound. So if you say those 2 sounds, together, it makes the ow sound. So the ow sound in the word now, it's that sound. Now the OW makes the ow sound. The OU in the word loud is another example. Technically it's made out of 2 diacritics again, but it's considered a sound on its own. So if you see the short A and right next to it you see the short U sound, it's ow. Next slide, please. Okay. The next 2 sounds, they're similar to the short A sound and the long A sound, except it's for another vowel. So this is the short E sound. It doesn't have anything on top of it. And this is the long E sound. Or this is the short E sound, and this is the long E sound. So the short E sound, similar to the short A sound, is just It's the shorter form of the sound, like the E in bed or the E in met. It's just the sound. On the other hand, since the next sound has a line on top of it, it's a long version of it. So it's the letter E. Again, as I said before, if you see any letter with a line on top of it, it's a long form of the vowel. So it's the vowel itself. So it's the EA in the word bead, or the EE in the phrase, in the word sleep. So it's just the E sound. Whenever you pronounce the sound of the alphabet within the word, that's the long E sound. And as you can see, it's spelled in different ways in the beginning, middle, and the end. And that's, again, something that you'll get better at as you understand languages and language patterns more. And one of the webinars will be covering that. So like this pair of sounds, the next pair is the short I and the long I sound. So the short I makes the I sound, like the I in the word tip or the I in the word dish. It's a shorter form of the sound, as I've reiterated. The long I is just the alphabet itself. It's pronounced I. So the UY in the word by or the I in the word sight, it's the I sound. So you'll also be seeing other sounds or other vowels as well. Always remember, if there's a line on top of it, it's the sound of it's the sound of the name of the vowel. If it's just the normal letter itself, it's the short form. Next slide. Yep. So the next two sounds, actually, they're slightly different in that they have one dot instead of two dots, but it doesn't really make a difference in pronunciation. I'll first do the O, the short O, because we've always been doing short than long. This is the short O sound. It's O with one dot on top of it. It's pronounced aw. So this is what I talked about a couple slides earlier. If it's A with two dots, it's ah. And if it's O with one dot, it's aw. So there is a difference between the two sounds. It's, for example, the AW in the word saw, or the A in the word all. Whenever you sort of make this circle shape with your mouth, that's the aw sound. And again, A with two dots or A with the umlaut, that's ah. O with the dot or the short O is aw. There is a pretty, the difference between those two sounds is pretty small, but you should be able to distinguish those two sounds, especially for like confusing words that you get in spelling bees. So that's the aw sound. The next sound is the long O. As I've said several times, it's just the sound of the alphabet itself. So it's O, like the O in the word bone, or the OW in the word snow. So again, this is an example of the fact that all vowels with a line are the alphabet itself. The next is also, we talked about the AU sound, the ow sound. The short O and the short I is another example of that. If you say the short O on its own is aw, the short I on its own is it. If you say aw and it together quickly, it sounds like oi. So the short O, the short I together is the oi sound or the oi diacritic. And it makes that sound as well in words. Like the OY in boy, you see the oi sound. Or the OI in coin, you hear the oi sound. So that's, you just have to know that sometimes when you see two vowels together, they make their own sound. So that's relatively easy. The next sound, this is also a little different because this is the short sound and this is the long sound. So similar to the O, the U with the dot is the short U sound. It's the sound, like pull or would. It makes the sound. Whereas on the other hand, U with two dots or U with the umlaut is the long U sound. So this one doesn't have a line on top of it. It has two dots, which you don't see in the other vowels, but you just have to know sort of. So the U in the word rule, it's the oo sound. Or the oo in the word fool. Whenever you say oo, it's U with two dots. Whenever you say oh, it's U with one dot. So it depends basically on the duration of how long you say the sound. So think about the examples. If you're saying oo, like the word fool, it's the long U or the U with the umlaut. If you're saying oo, like the word would, it's U with the short U sound. Next slide. Next up are the consonants. The consonants, for the most part, they're similar to the regular letters that you have in English. That's why we're not going to go over all of them, because most of them are just the letter making its own sound. Like the N diacritic is the na sound. That's all of those are self-explanatory. It's mainly the vowels that are hard, but some diacritics are a little bit hard because sometimes these letters, it's the letters themselves are associated with different sounds. G is just the g sound, so go, big. It's important to know that G is the hard g sound. So if you see something like gem, even though it has a G in itself, that's the soft sound. It has the j sound. But the word go, it has the g sound. So G is for the g sound, not for words that start or have G. That's because G, depending on the letter after the G can be pronounced ga in some words or ja in other words. So only if it's ga, it's the G diacritic. And skipping the order a little bit, since the sounds are related, This is for words with the j sound. So even if it has a G and it's spelled the j sound, you'd use the J diacritic. So gem is the example that's easiest to think about. Generally, if the G is before an I or an E, it makes the j sound. And if it's before like an A, O, or a U, it makes the g sound. So that might help you. It's a small rule. It's more of a pronunciation rule than a spelling rule, but it's helpful. So again, the g sound is G, the j sound is J, regardless of how both the sounds are spelled. The next sound is basically the mix of the G sound and the N sound. It's pronounced it's not hard. The sound is not hard itself. It's more of a softened version. So sing, you don't say sing, like you don't, the G at the end isn't as hard. It's a little bit more subtle. So sing, finger, things like that. So that's the g sound. Again, it's this is the g sound, this is the j sound, and this is the g sound. Okay, next up is the z sound. This is relatively straightforward. Generally seen in words with z or s, in this case se, like zebra or raise. It's the z sound, which is pretty phonetic. Next slide, please. Okay, so we'll do some examples. Since again, we have a lot of people, it's not possible for all of you guys to answer, but say the answer in your mind as you see this, and I'll confirm with you. So I'll give it like 3 seconds per word. Okay, this is pronounced giraffe. J makes the j sound. This is the schwa, the sound. So j so far. R is the r sound, that's straightforward. This is the short a sound, it's a, and then it's followed by the f, the f sound. So giraffe. And if you move on to the next, you'll see that it's correct. Being able to read this quickly is really important. You have to practice a lot with mastering your diacritics. That's the first step. That's the only way you can build on and move forward. It's not possible to learn a lot of spelling if you don't understand to read diacritics. Because whenever you go to the dictionary, chances are diacritics are the only form of pronunciation given. It should be sort of like a second language. As soon as you see the word, you should immediately associate the sound of it. So that's why you need a lot of practice with this. We'll be doing a few more examples. Next slide. So this word, as you can see, has 2 pronunciations. Try to figure out what both of them are. I'll give it 3 seconds again. Okay, so let's go over this sound by sound. This is the n sound, this is the a sound, sh makes the sh sound, n is the n sound, this is the sound, this is the l sound. So national is the first. And the second pronunciation, you can see that it's a little bit different, but it's mainly the same. N makes the n sound, this is a short a, it's the a sound, so na so far. Sh makes the sh sound, nash. This is the schwa, it's the sound, so nasha so far. N makes the n sound. This is a smaller schwa, meaning it's pronounced more subtly. And this is the l sound. So national. So it's the word national. It's either national or national. So you can see that the second schwa in this is a little bit more subtle, national. It's more of like a connecting sound between the N and the L than a separate sound on its own. Whenever you see a sound in a superscript, like when it's small and towards the top, that means it's very subtly pronounced. It's more of a connecting sound than a diacritic on its own. That's something to keep in mind. And there are also a few smaller things here that are worth noting. They don't contribute to the pronunciation as much, but they are helpful. You can see right here, 1 second. There is, you can see these markings right here. Whenever you see this, it means that there's stress to the pronunciation. So the first syllable has the most stress, or you say the most, or you put most of your emphasis on that syllable. So it's national. If you saw the symbol right here, it's not the same as a quotation mark. It's slightly different. If you had that symbol here instead of there, it'd be national. So it's important to understand where those marks are, since the first one is right here. That means the main stress is right there. So it's national. The emphasis goes towards the beginning. So depending on where that mark is, that's where you put most of your stress into. Next slide, please. This again, I'll give 3 seconds. Keep in mind that there are a few stress markings here. That's what those terms are called, stress markings. Okay. Yeah, it's democracy. So let me go over the sounds individually. This is the duh sound. This is the schwa. It makes the sound. First, when you're starting off with diacritics, don't focus on the stress markings yet. First, understand what the idea of the word is, and then look at the stress markings. So this is duh so far. M makes the m sound. This is the a with the umlaut, or a with the 2 dots. It's the sound. So dama so far. K makes the k sound. R makes the r sound. This is the schwa, makes the sound. S makes the s sound, and this is the long E, or the sound of the alphabet E, so E. So it's democracy so far. And since we have the stress marking here, it is democracy. The main focus of the word, or the main stress of the word, goes within the second syllable. So if it was here, for example, it would be democracy. Or if it was here, it would be democracy. So depending on where you see the stress marking, that's where the stress, or that's where the main focus goes. So again, it's democracy. You might be wondering what these markings are. These are sort of just to divide the syllables. They're also stress markings, but they're not as important. They're like, I guess, lesser stress markings. So this is just to separate that this word has 4 syllables. So there's one right here, one right here, one right here, and one right here. The main marks that you need to worry about, of course, are the actual diacritics themselves and the primary stress marking, which is right here. Okay, next slide, please. So I think that was a good intro to diacritic marks. Make sure to practice that. If you get unabridged, or if you get the unabridged dictionary, there is a page that has all the diacritic marks as well as audio files of their pronunciations. So that's another good reason to get it. As an introductory resource, it gives you an introduction to diacritic marks. So if you want more practice with that, just buy the unabridged dictionary, and you should have an option to practice that. Okay, so now on to the actual rules. As we said in the beginning of the presentation, spelling might be intimidating because of the sheer number of words, because there's so many, but all the words are sort of organized into different rules that you can follow. Some of them are language patterns that, again, is a topic for another webinar, but others are just general spelling rules that you can apply for all words, or most words. These words do have some exceptions, but those exceptions are they're much smaller in number. So if you understand the rules, you'll be in a good place for in terms of like a strong foundation, and from there you can build on with exceptions and things like that. And to answer the question on the chat, simply just the dictionary. There's no list of words that are written with diacritic marks, but if you search up any word, it'll give you the diacritic marks. Also on SpellPundit, when you're typing words in the modules, there are audio pronunciations, but there are also diacritic marks that are written down, or that are given both in the learning and testing modes. So you can also read the word through diacritic marks if you prefer. So again, diacritic marks are just symbols to learn the pronunciations. So there are different ways to practice them. First, use the dictionary as your source, and spell to understand and better see how they're used in more words. And as you do more SpellPundit, all the words have diacritic pronunciations. So you'll have much better practice with diacritic marks. Hopefully that answers your question. Cool. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're starting off with a relatively basic rule. It doesn't, this is not something that you can apply for too many words because it's talking about a specific combination, but it is something that people often miss. I've seen words from this list being asked in spelling bees. Some of these have been asked in my school spelling bee in the past years. At least one of these words, or one of the words in this list, they've asked at a national spelling bee in the last 2-3 years. So you can see this is a rule that helps you in all the different levels. So for the seed ending, the main spellings that people get confused between are CEDE, SEDE, and CEED. So you have to understand when each ending is used. And that's much more effective than just memorizing the words because there are only around 20 words, a little bit more in this list. But if you just memorize all of them together, chances are you'll probably get confused between the words. So if you categorize them into different endings and then learn the words, that'll be much more sensible. So the 3 different ways that the sound can end, or this combination can be spelled: SEDE, CEED, and CEDE. So it doesn't make sense to learn all 3 of them. If you learn 2 of them, if you learn all the words in 2 of them, and you're 100% with those words, everything else will be spelled the other way. So, for example, SEDE, there are only 2 words with it: supersede, SUPERSEDE, and obsede, OBSEDE. So if you learn those 2 words, nothing else in the dictionary is spelled with SEDE. Similarly, there are only 3 words with CEED: proceed, succeed, and exceed. So these 5 words, and that's relatively small. If you remember, supersede and obsede have SEDE, proceed, succeed, and exceed have CEED. Everything else for the seed ending is CEDE. If you somehow forget this information, CEDE is more likely because statistically there are more words. So yeah. So supersede, if you just learn that supersede is SUPE or SEDE, you won't have to worry about other words. And to answer the question on the chat, SUPE or CEDE, it's better not to learn that as a word because it is a variant. It's an unlisted variant of SUPE or SEDE. So the main entry of the word is SUPE or SEDE. If you learn that plus the other word in the list, along with proceed, succeed, and exceed, everything else you can spell CEDE. So if you learn those 5 words that we put on the slide, everything else you can stick with the more common spelling, CEDE. So that's that. Next slide, please. This is a rule that applies for a lot more words. It's also a relatively basic rule, or a rule that you might have already noticed in words that you've seen, but it's important to go over it as well. Adjectives generally end with OUS. Nouns generally end with US. For example, glorious, it's an adjective that ends with OUS. Nervous is an adjective that ends with OUS. Joyous, and a lot of other words. The majority of adjectives end with OUS. Nouns, or rather, if a word ends with US, it has the us sound, and it's a noun. So if you hear any word with the us sound and they say the part of speech is a noun, chances are it's probably spelled US. And if you hear a word that ends with us and they say it's an adjective, it's probably OUS. There are some exceptions to this. We're not going to go over that because this is more of an introductory webinar, but the vast majority, over 99% of the words If it's an adjective that ends with the us sound, it's OUS. If it's a noun that ends with the us sound, it's US. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, next is in terms of adding prefixes. So prefixes, as many of you know, they are the beginning parts of the word. They aren't the root itself, the root word itself. For example, in disconnect, the base word there is the word connect. This is the prefix that you're adding in front. So sometimes, or most of the times actually, you just add the prefix and the word itself, and that forms the word. Generally, the base word isn't modified. So dis plus connect is just disconnect. In plus apparent is just inapparent. Most of the time, when you add the prefix, the base word doesn't change. Sometimes you might see double consonants or sometimes even double vowels, but that's fine as long as everything is accounted for in the pronunciation. Like re plus evaporation, it's re-evaporation. So even though the double E might not look as good there, you need two E's in order for the word to follow the phonetics there. So misspell, even though it might not look as well, or it might not look as good with two S's there. It's miss, the prefix, and the word spell. So that's why there are two S's there. So just be aware that sometimes double letters might occur when you add the prefix. Next slide, please. So similarly, you should also be adept with adding suffixes. Suffixes are the endings themselves for the words. So the NESS is the suffix for dark, or dark in the word darkness. Most of the times, if you're just adding, most of the times you just add the ness or the li or whatever suffix that you want to the end of the word, but sometimes it becomes harder if the last word ends with a Y. So that rule, this is important. Sometimes people do get confused with this. If the word ends with a Y, you have to change the Y to an I, and only after that you add the suffix. So that's why happiness has an I. That's why iciness has an I, even though happy and icy are both like they both end with a Y. So that's this rule. Another, this is slightly more advanced, but I'll just briefly talk about the topic. Sometimes the spelling of the prefix changes when you're adding a prefix. Like for example, the word suffix is an example of this because the base word there is fix. The prefix there for the word, for that word, is sub. So suffix, the people who decided to coin that word, suffix didn't sound as good. So they made it suffix. Sometimes they change the spelling of the prefix if it sounds better along with the second part of the word. So that process is called assimilation. It might get confusing, but it's a topic that is important to know, especially for intermediate spellers. The spelling of the base word never changes. If anything changes, it's the spelling of the prefix. That's another thing that's worth mentioning along with these prefixes and suffixes. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is something that people also get confused with. It's words that end with FUL versus FULL. If you're trying to make something end with the full ending, it's spelled FUL, not FULL. The word full is FULL, obviously, but the ending is FUL. For example, fruitful is fruit and the FUL ending. Beautiful is beauty plus the word full. And this follows the rule that we said earlier. If it ends with a Y, generally speaking, it becomes an I. So that's why beautiful has an I. But it's also important to note that it ends with FUL. So unless the word literally means something that's filled with something, which you only see in maybe around 10 words, as it says on the slide, you generally don't see that. So if you're adding the ly ending, which is the adverb ending to a word that ends with ful, like thankful plus the ly ending, you'll see two L's. But that's not because it comes from the word full. It's thankful plus the ly ending. Artfully comes from the word artful plus the ly ending. So very rarely do you see words that have actual full as a suffix. It's generally a certain word and a hyphen and then full. It's not always the case, but you do see that in a lot of words. Bankful means when the bank is literally full. So bank and then hyphen, word full. There are some exceptions here and there, but never confuse the rules with the exceptions. You should always be 100% with the rule and then memorize the exceptions. If you start learning the exceptions as you learn the rule, you'll just get confused. So that's not something I recommend doing. And always, when in doubt, and you have absolutely no idea how to spell the word, FUL also makes more sense because it's the more common ending. Next slide, please. Okay. This is the ISE versus IZE. First of all, Merriam-Webster is quintessentially an American dictionary. So most words with I's have IZE. It's not a wise idea to spell words with ISE unless that's the only possible spelling. Just because there are more words and more variants with IZE, because that's generally seen as the more American ending. So verbs that end with eyes, with the eyes sound, they're spelled IZE, like harmonize. Harmony plus the eyes ending is harmonize, vaporize, etc. So always, if it's an option, use the IZE ending because it's way more common than ISE. Words that have ISE, they're generally after, they follow the letter V. Like for example, supervise, advise, revise, improvise, etc. Most of these words have VISE at the end because they're related to the word vision. That's obviously not always the case, but it's there in some words like supervise. But generally you see the VISE ending in a lot of words. And sometimes if it's part of a syllable on its own, this doesn't apply to as many words, but in those cases, ISE is also logical spelling. So excise, X plus size, incise, surprise. Sometimes if it's within a certain syllable, ISE is used. Again, it's not as common, but it is used. And there are almost twice as many IZE words than ISE words. That's another thing to keep in mind. So IZE is undoubtedly more common. Next slide, please. This is something that I've seen a lot of this is a relatively basic rule that I've seen a lot of people missing in. It's adding CK versus C for endings. If you have a basic understanding of phonetics, you'll understand why this is the case. Basically, this is something that I said about the G, the short G, or the soft G and the hard G. We'll first go over that rule again. Generally, if you see the G sound, if it's the G diacritic, let me use text instead. It makes the G sound. And it's followed by GI, words with GI and GE. So let me write that on the screen. Well, it might be a little bit blurry, but again, follow what I'm saying. If it's the short G sound, it's the G sound and it's spelled with GE or GI, or sorry, I wrote that wrong. I apologize for that. If you see the J sound, sorry, yeah. If you see the J sound, which is the J, it's spelled J, J-U-H, and it's pronounced J, J-U-H, and it's spelled with G-E or G-I. or obviously with a J if there are words with a J. And when you see the G sound, which is this, it's pronounced G. Let me write that down as well. It's spelled G-A, G-U, or G-O. So whenever a sound is hard, it's followed by an A, O, or a U. That's something that works for almost all languages. It works across all languages for almost all words. And if it's a soft sound, like the J sound, it's generally followed by an E or an I. So that's that. Similarly, you might be wondering why I'm talking about the J sound when the slide is about the C sound. It's a very similar rule for C versus K or CK. So let me clear what's on the screen. Yeah. If it is the K sound, which is K, it can obviously be spelled with CK or K, but if it's spelled with a C, it's spelled CA, CO, or CU. Because again, if it's a hard sound, it's almost always followed by A, O, or a U. And if it's the hard sound, which or if it's a soft sound, which let me write that down, is the S diacritic. Because keep in mind, the S sound, C can make either the K sound in some words or the S sound in other words. So you have the K diacritic and the S diacritic. The S diacritic is the soft sound, and that makes the S sound, and it's followed by CI and CE. Keep in mind, this is only talking about C for the K versus the S sound. Other letters like the K and the CK, they can be spelled whatever they want for the K sound. But always, if there's a hard version of the sound and it's either a C or a G, it's going to be followed by A, O, or U. If it's a soft version of the sound and it's a C or a G, it's going to be followed by an I or an E. Hopefully that was clear to everyone. It's easier if you see examples with the word, but if you remember that rule, that can guide you as to why this rule works. So back to that. Picnic is PIC. It has the K sound in the end, so that doesn't make any difference. It's pronounced the hard way, so picnic, it has the K diacritic. But if you spelled it, and this is not the correct spelling, I'm just illustrating how it would be if this rule wasn't there. Give me one second. If you had something like this, PICNICING, that would be picnicing, because always you need either an A, O, or a U after the C to make the hard sound. Since that's not here in this word, it makes the soft version. So the word is pronounced picnicking though, so you can't really spell it this way. That's why you need an extra sound to harden it. So that's why you have the K. That's why this rule works for all of these words, and that's why there aren't really many exceptions to this. So picnic becomes picnicked or picnicking, because you want the hard sound again. Panic becomes panicked or panicking. Mimic becomes mimicked or mimicking, etc. So always, if you have the hard C, if a word ends with a hard C and you want to have the hard sound maintained, you have to enter a K after. So I hope that rule was clear. Next slide, please. Okay. Suffixes that begin with vowels. This is something that can be confusing, but if you think about it, it makes sense. So if a word ends with an E, always drop the E before adding the suffix. Again, there are exceptions to this. I'm not saying there aren't, but it works for the vast majority of words. If you're a beginning speller, if you follow this rule, it'll help you for more than 99% of the words, which is amazing. But for example, the word desiring, it comes from the word desire. That's the base word plus the ing suffix. So it's not spelled the same way as desire and the ing suffix together. you have to cut off the E there because the E is silent. It's not pronounced. So it's just DESIRING. Similarly, for achieving or achievable, you're going to have to remove the final E in the word before adding the suffix. And that's just because there's only one vowel pronounced. So you have to take away the E at the end because it wouldn't have a pronunciation there. However, if it ends with GE or CE, they keep the silent E. And the reason why this is true is because always, if you want the soft sound, the J or the S sound, you need the E or you need the E or the I after. And already these words have an E. So for the word to still be pronounced bounceable, you need it to be spelled BOUNCEABLE. Or for the word to be pronounced courageous instead of courageous, you need the E to be kept. And this is again just to make sure that the sound is pronounced the same way. If it was BOUNCABLE, it would be pronounced bouncable, and that's not what the actual word is pronounced as. So keep that in mind. Always, if you have the hard pronunciation and you have a C, it's CACOCU. If you have the soft C and it's spelled with the C, it's CI or CE, and the same rule applies for the G. I've said that several times throughout the presentation, but it's really important to grasp that rule because that guides you with so many words. Next slide, please. So suffixes that begin with consonants. Generally, keep the final E if the suffix ends with a consonant. There are some exceptions here and there. Some of them are common words that you should just have heard of in general, but most words follow this rule. Like for example, if it's all, this is the example here, but another more common example is the word awesome. So that comes from the word all, AWE, and the word some, SOME. So that's why awesome retains the E. You keep the E if the second part starts with a consonant. Same applies for all this. Astutely, it means being astute or sharp. Since the suffix ends with a consonant, you keep the E. So it's ASTUTELY. There are some exceptions, like the word argument or the word truly, but those words are really common. You're more likely than not seen those words before. So that's that. Next slide, please. Okay, this is also a rule that works for a specific group of words, but it's helpful overall. IFY versus EFY. It's generally IFY. You don't see too many words with EFY, but there are some. So most of them end with IFY. IFY is just an ending on its own. Some of them are EFY, but they're basically from the word itself. If there's a root, for example, putrefy, liquefy, stupefy. It's mainly something you'd have to memorize. But if you've seen the words before, that helps you a lot more. So you can either make the asterisk EFY asterisk list or the asterisk EFY list in SpellPundit or the dictionary. They'll give you the same results because it's a small list. But if you make the EFY list, everything else is spelled IFY. Again, just because there are words with EFY doesn't mean it's a significantly used spelling. There are only 14 words with it compared to like 280 words with IFY. So unless you're 100% sure that it's EFY, IFY is just the safer spelling to go with because it's seen in more words. So whenever you're learning the words with two different combinations, see which one's more popular or which one has more words. That should be the spelling that you sort of set aside. And if the other list has very few words in it, just make the entire list and memorize all the words in that. That way you can be 100% confident that everything else is spelled the main way. So that's that. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a little bit of a confusing rule. Okay, before that, I'll answer the question in the chat because that's important. There is no specific rule for IFY versus EFY. It just depends on what the actual root is, and for that, you'd have to be good with the roots. Since there are lesser words with EFY, personally, it's easier just to make the entire list. because it's a really small list, 14 words.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And answering the latest question on the chat, we'll just go back to answer specific questions towards the end. Yeah. This is a harder rule because this is mainly based on the actual language itself, and there are a lot of factors about context within the word. So that's why it's hard to make a generalization for IE versus EI. We've put together a rule for that works for a lot of words. But keep in mind, there will be exceptions to this. And you'll just, for a lot of these exceptions, some of them you just have to memorize, but other words, as you understand language patterns, those exceptions will no longer be exceptions anymore. This is more of the basic form of the rule. As you learn about language patterns and roots, a lot of those exceptions will no longer be hard, and you have very few words left to memorize. So the rule for IE versus EI is I is generally before the E, except before the C sound or the A sound or after the I sound. It's a little bit long, but that's the most comprehensive we can get it to. Most words with the long E sound have IE, or most words with the long E have the IE, like brief, yield, believe, etc. But there are exceptions as listed on the screen. Again, focus first, be 100% with the rule. After you know how to apply the rule and when to apply it, focus on the exceptions after. And answering the question on the chat, because that's important. This is where language patterns really comes into hand. And again, you'll be learning about that in 2 webinars later. But EI and IE are both used in German words, and both of them are used a lot. They're used for different sounds. So language patterns, a very basic idea of what that is, it's specifically for each language, how each sound is spelled. So it's hard to generalize for all German words because for different sounds, you have different spellings. But if you analyze each sound specifically, as you'll be learning in language patterns, you'll see when EI is used more, when IE is used more. A direct answer is it depends on how the sound is pronounced. Back to what I was saying, most of the words with a long E in English have IE. Some words are exceptions. And similarly, the next, the exception, as we talked about right here in the beginning of the rule, is except after the long C. So if you hear the C sound, instead of just the E sound, it might be spelled another way, like ceiling has EI, perceive has EI, conceit has EI. You generally don't see words with CIE as much. It's not as popular as CEI. There's no particular reason as to why this rule works. It's been something that's sort of ingrained into the English language. Other words with the long A sound have EI. You generally don't see IE for the long A sound, like slay. Slay, technically, EI makes the A sound and GH is silent. Same with the word 8, EI makes the A sound, the GH is silent. For feign, technically it's EIG, but that's because EI makes the A sound, G is silent, and you have N making the N sound. Same with neighbor, you have EI making the A sound, GH being silent. The easiest example for this is the word vain, because EI makes the A sound there. Or chow mein, EI makes the A sound in chow mein. It's not a hard and fast rule, but it does work for a lot of words. For words with the she sound, they have IE. So this is C, like ceiling. This is she, like ancient. So that's when CIE is generally used. A lot of words have CIENT or CI and then another ending. So it's not really it's not really an IE here, as you might think. It's C and or it's A and CI making one part together, and then the ENT suffix. And prefixes, suffixes, you'll be learning about for the next webinar. But that's the gist of this rule.
So when it said when you said chow mein, how do you spell that?
No, chow mein, it's a phrase. CHOW and then MEIN.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So those were most of the rules. And then if it has the I sound, IE makes more sense. This is for words in English or words that have passed through English, not necessarily for other languages. English words, like science, it has IE making the I sound. Society, it has IE making the I sound. It's honestly more of, if you want to understand the etymology behind it, it's science comes from SCI, that's one part. It comes from the Latin root scire, meaning to know, and then ENCE. Same with society. The first part, SOCI, comes from like the word social, and then ETY is the second part. So it's not really IE on its own. It's the first part has an I, the second part has an E. But regardless, just to make it more simple, we consider that as an example of IE. So that's that. Next slide, please. Yeah. So again, this is just more of a recap. I is before E generally, except after the C sound or the A sound or the I sound. Those are the three cases in which EI is used instead. So that's that. The next rule is IBLE and ABLE. ABLE, first of all, is more common than IBLE. There are several rules. I'll talk about them in a bit. But generally, if it's a complete word, it ends with ABLE. And if it's like an incomplete word, it ends with IBLE. That is the rule that I've heard the most, like understand plus the able becomes understandable, ABLE, breakable becomes break plus ABLE. But you see that there are some exceptions here for the rule, right? Oh, sorry, that was a little bit large, but you see that there are some exceptions to this. So there's a second rule that helps that I personally found more helpful. Next slide, please. So I'll skip a little bit ahead in order to elaborate on what that rule is. It's this second rule right here. So if the noun ends with ION, it becomes IBLE, like expansion becomes expansible, contraction becomes contractible, conversion becomes convertible. And Uncle, can you go back to the previous slide again? I'll use it to explain something. So flexible, the word flexion exists, dismission exists, so dismissible. So like it doesn't work for all the words, but it does help you understand some of them. So if you understand both the rules, that is helpful. Personally, I like the ION rule a little bit more. So the noun or the base word ends with ION, it ends with IBLE. But the important thing is find one rule and stick to that rule. If you mix and match, you're gonna get confused between the exceptions because you're gonna have to learn the exceptions for one rule. If you start using both of the rules at the same time, you'll inevitably get confused. Both of the rules are good because they're effective. It's your personal choice as to which one you use because they have about the same number of exceptions. Again, I'll repeat both of them. If it's a complete word and you're adding the able suffix, it's generally ABLE. If it's incomplete, it's generally IBLE. Or the other rule is if the noun ends with ION and it becomes then it becomes IBLE. And was someone saying something?
Yeah, can you go back to the last slide?
This? Yeah, sure.
Okay, thank you. You can go back.
Okay. And next slide, please. So this is just another recap of what we did before. So again, complete, generally it's ABLE, incomplete it is generally IBLE. There are some exceptions, but that's why you pick one rule and stick to that rule instead of confusing yourself between the two rules. We're listing two rules here because there are options, but again, as I said several times, stick to one rule. I can't stress the importance of that. Okay, next slide. Okay, answering your question, complete versus incomplete words. If it comes from a full word, it is complete. And if it comes from a root or part of a word, it's incomplete. That's what I meant. Hopefully that answers your question. So the next is plural nouns. These rules change between languages. It's easier to understand it for language patterns, but a basic understanding is you generally add an S to the end of the word if it's plural. That is relatively common knowledge, but you add ES sometimes. And you add ES if the word ends with the S sound or the X sound or the Ch sound or the Z sound. So bus becomes buses, box becomes boxes, quartz becomes quartzes, wish becomes wishes. That's just because all these sounds, if you notice, they're pronounced sort of similarly. So bus doesn't really make sense if you're trying to add an S to it, or box doesn't really make sense if you're adding an S to it. So since those sounds are similar, that's why they add an extra E and then the S. So you have to understand why that rule works. And that's the logic as to why. Next slide. So if a word ends with a Y, if a singular ends with a Y, the plural becomes, you take away the Y and you add IES. So penny becomes pennies, spy becomes spies, city becomes cities, etc. These rules, again, if you think of basic words with them, you'll remember these rules. So if you think of, like, for example, city and cities, you won't have trouble with any of those words. Similarly, if it's a vowel ending with an F or LF, the F becomes a V and then you add the ES. So again, if you think of loaf and loaves, apply that rule for all the other words that have a similar ending. So same for thief and thieves, or shelf and shelves. Same if there's a silent E at the end because it's the same sound. So knife becomes knives, life becomes lives, etc. Next slide, please. The next is, it doesn't really affect your spelling too much, but it's important to know. Some words have the same singular and the same plural. Cattle is the same for singular and plural. So there's nothing really that you have to change for your spelling if they say it's a plural noun. But some words have irregular plurals. Those words you should know. You should try consolidating them. There's no way to make a list of them because there's no search possible. But they are good to know together. For example, child becoming children, goose becoming geese, etc. And this is specific for Latin. And again, it's more of something that you'll see when you learn language patterns. But if it ends with IX or EX, it becomes ICES, or it becomes ICES. So index, you take away the EX and you make it ICES. So index becomes indices, and then matrix becomes matrices. If you're currently talking, please mute yourself. Yeah.
Pieces.
So apex becomes apices. Always, if you end it with EX or IX, the plural is ICES. Okay. Next slide, please.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
So you know how sometimes you're saying that you can just remember the words because there are very few words with that rule?
Yeah.
So I think there are these words called like mutant verbs or irregular verbs, right? That
Yes.
when you change it to plural, when you change it to plural, it's ending and changes like knife into knives, right?
Yeah.
So can we remember that as a rule?
Yeah, we actually talked about that just a little bit ago. If it ends with an F, or if there's like a silent letter after that, I believe it came the slide before. Yeah, if there's a vowel and an F, or a vowel and an F, and then a silent letter, it becomes a V instead. So it's a small minor, yeah, it's a minor rule, but it's still a rule and it works for the words.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. The next confusing rule within plurals is like OS versus OES. So, for example, generally you add an, if the word ends with an O, that is, or yeah, if the word ends with an O, you just add an S to it generally. If it's preceded by a vowel, like for example, ratio has an I before the O, so it becomes ratios. Toes, since the base word itself is TOE, it doesn't make sense to spell it TOS, so it's TOES. And it doesn't, the word toe also doesn't end with an E, but it's preceded by a vowel. That's why it makes sense to follow this rule. If it's preceded by a consonant, like jingo, for example, it's preceded by a G, which is a consonant, it becomes jingos. Tornado becomes tornadoes, etc. So think about what the preceding letter is. If it's a vowel, it's generally just a regular S. And if it's a consonant, it's generally ES. And the reason you don't have an ES for vowels, that's because if it's a certain letter and then the vowel, if it's a vowel, and then after that you have the letter O, and after that you have an ES, that's 3 vowels together. That just doesn't look right. That's the reason why you don't add an extra ES if O is preceded by the vowel. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I think this answers one of the questions on the chat. The Latin I plural, if the singular ends with a US, the plural is formed by adding an I, removing the US and adding an I. Alumnus becomes alumni, radius becomes radii, stimulus becomes stimuli, etc. If the singular is US, the plural is I, it has the long I pronunciation. If the singular is A, the plural is AE, and it forms the E pronunciation, the long E pronunciation generally. So alumna becomes alumni, vertebra becomes vertebrae, medusa becomes medusae. So always, if you have, it's pretty effective, but if you're confused about the plural, think about what the singular is. If the singular ends with an A, it's probably AE. If the singular ends with US, it's probably I. That is the main rule that works most effectively for AE versus I in Latin plurals. So hopefully that answers your question. Words with double I's. So you have to think about what it ends with, or what the base word is. So the radii, the singular is radius. So even though it has an I before, you're still removing the US and adding an I. So radius becomes radii. So even though the plural itself has a double I, you're still following the rule for US. So yeah, looks like that answers your question. Next slide, please. Again, for Latin plurals, if it ends with or on, it becomes a as the plural. So if you're confused about the plural and it ends with an a, or ends with the sound, chances are the singular ends with a or the on. For example, addendum becomes addenda. An addendum is like stuff that you add at the end. Bacterium, the plural is bacteria. Criterion is the singular, criteria is the plural. The word data is actually a plural, and the singular is datum. So that's another example of this rule. And yeah, if the next rule is if it's Greek or Latin and it ends with SIS, as the singular, the plural is SES. So ellipsis becomes ellipses, crisis becomes crises, synopsis becomes synopses. That's the only change you have to make. You don't have to add anything else. You just have to change the I to an E. Next slide, please. Yeah, so that concludes all the rules that we're discussing for this webinar. So you guys are free to ask questions. First, I'll answer the one that I saw in the chat. The singular of parentheses is parenthesis. You just have to work backwards. If the plural ends with es, the e was replaced by an I, so it's parenthesis is the singular with sis. So hopefully that answers your question. Back to rule 9. Okay, let's go back to rule 9. What was your question about rule 9? Or did you just want to go back to take notes?
Yeah, at this time, if you have a question, either you can type in or you can actually speak.
Yeah.
I had a question on what petroleum would be if it was like plural. What would that be?
Well, petroleum doesn't really have a plural, or the plural isn't really used as much because petroleum is the name of a substance. Technically, the plural is petroleums, which I guess you could call an exception, but you don't really hear the plural of that word used because it's a substance. Like, for example, oxygen is also a substance, just like the word petroleum. You don't really see people use the term oxygens, even though oxygen technically does have a plural. So there are words like that that have plurals. They might not really follow the rules, but that's just because those words aren't really countable.
So does it not have a plural at all, or is
No,
the
it has a
plural right
it
there?
has a plural, but there's no practical need to learn it because
okay.
yeah, it's straightforward. Plus, you can't really use the plural.
Okay.
Sahas, what's your question?
So where can we find the link to this recording? Since I joined 30 minutes late, thinking that started at 4 o'clock instead of 2 o'clock. So will this be in our Gmail?
We'll send the details later. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
What would be the like country origination if it ended in AE as plural?
Okay, it's generally Latin. Sometimes it is Greek, but it's generally Latin.
Also, didn't Advait, I think, want to review rule 9?
Yeah, we went over that.
So what's the question on, is there a question on rule 9?
Is there any specific question on it?
Where can we get the link to the PowerPoint?
We'll send you the link to the recording later on, okay?
No, I'm talking about like the actual PowerPoint, the slides you used.
Yeah, so we'll only share the recording. Probably we are still working on this PowerPoint, so to add other examples, etc. So this is not ready to be shared at this time.
Oh, okay.
Okay, to answer the latest question on the chat, the easiest way to identify the origin of a word is to ask the origin because they'll give it to you in the B. Yeah.
Quick question.
Sure.
Will we be discussing homonyms in any of the webinars?
No, not really. The webinars will cover these 3 pieces, the prefixes in the next one, and then the language patterns. And the webinars is not part of this series. We can add that to the future ones.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, someone wanted help with rule 13. Can we go back to that slide? The next one. I think the third version or the third slide within this. Yeah, this one. So if a word ends with ix or ex, take that away and then add ices. So apex, take away the ex, it becomes apices. Index, take away the ex, add ices in its place, it becomes indices. Matrix, take away the ix, the plural is matrices. So that's how you distinguish, or that's how you follow the rule for that.
So will it always be like ICES?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, chassis is not a Latin word. So that's why if you go back to the rule that we had, it said it's mainly for Latin and Greek. So the plural of chassis is not chass. Yes. The plural of the word chasse is chass, but that's another word. The plural for chassis is either the word itself or chassis. Yes, it has two plural forms, but it's the spelling you gave is another word. And Gia, to answer your question, goose is it's an exception. It's an irregular noun or an irregular plural. So that's the exception, not other words. EAE versus EI versus II with the same pronunciations. You have to think about the singular is, and that might sound a little generic, but words with II, most of them have a singular. Some of them are plurals with no other singular entry, like for example, Latin tribes. You see a few words with II at the end. There's nothing really you can do for those words, but for the majority of words, think about what the singular is and use that to figure out what the plural might be. EAE words, they're generally taxonomic words, meaning that you generally see them in like words that have genus, family, order, or things like that in the definition. EI, that's more of a singular based thing. So find what the singular is. If the singular ends with EUS, it becomes EI. Hopefully that answers your question. Okay. Answering another question I saw in the chat. There are far more rules, or there are far more words that follow rules than words that have exceptions. So it's better to learn the rules because rules will give you overall, it's hard to generalize, but they'll give you at least 75%, generally more of the total chunk of words. So it's much easier to learn the exceptions than to just have an arbitrary pattern. So learn rules, learn all and know how to apply the rule, when to apply the rule, and then focus on memorizing the exceptions after that. Okay. Any other questions?
I have one question. So, everybody is saying in the chat that you can either say lice or louse. So would you say lice or louse? I'm still confused about that.
It depends on the singular, the plural. The singular form is louse, the plural form is lice.
Oh, I thought it
So
was the other way around.
lice is plural. Generally you don't have just one louse in your head. So people say lice more often, but the singular is louse.
Okay.
And answering what I saw in the chat, there are not 13 rules overall. That's way too less. We have 13 examples of basic rules, and these will help you with your fundamentals. But there are countless rules. A lot of the rules are language patterns, and we just covered some of the basic rules. Rules you can discover as you see more words. If you see a lot of words follow a certain pattern, you can essentially consider that your own rule. The best way to study exceptions is, first of all, identify the version that's more common or the version that follows the rule. So then you know the possible ways that exceptions can be spelled. If it's something that you can't make a proper advanced search of from the dictionary or from SpellPundit, consolidate such words as you study. If it's something that you can make a list of and it's a relatively small list, then make the list and memorize the words in the list. That is the best advice for exceptions.
How do we memorize like the language of a root word through the SpellPundit root module?
The language would be given, so you can learn that as you learn the root.
Yeah, in the root module, I think we arrange them in the difficulty level as well as by language. So all the Latin roots are in one place, and then obviously we also arrange them differently. So how do you know whether a root comes from the Latin or Greek or some other one? So that's yeah, that's a tough one. So you need to know, I guess. You need to memorize.
It's something you have to associate with the root. So that's why instead of just learning the definition of root, you should also learn the language, because the only reason you learn roots is to be able to ask them in bees. And for you to ask the root in the bee, you have to give 3 pieces of information. One is the correct pronunciation of the root. The second is the definition of the root, the correct definition. And the third is the correct language of origin. Only if all those 3 pieces of information match, they'll give you a yes or no, or that's the only time they'll say yes. So you have to learn all 3 pieces of information. The pronunciation is not that big of a deal because most of them, they're easy to figure out. The language of origin you have to know, and the definition you have to know. So that's why I learned both of them together. Anything else?
Okay, it's 3:35, 3:36 here in Central Time. So if no other questions, we'll be here for a few more minutes if there are still questions, but if not, Navneet, thank you so much. So you covered so well of all these complicated rules. I hope other spellers picked up some of those. Thank you for doing this webinar, much appreciated.
Yeah, no problem, Uncle. It was a great opportunity.
Thank you for doing this webinar.
See you next week.
Will you send the recording of the Zoom?
Yeah, we will send, yeah.
Where can we find said recording?
Thank you.
We'll put it somewhere and send you the recording. So we'll most likely not YouTube or some other place.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay, Navneet, there are 30 people. I'm not really sure if there are any additional questions. I don't believe so. But again, thank you so much. It came out really nice. So I'm just sitting here listening, and so it came across very nice. So that I think everybody was able to follow.
Yeah, it's a good session, Navneet. Thank you so much for your time.
No problem.